speakers. Suchetana Chatterjee, Sukanya Sinha, Suprakash C Roy discuss the journeys that inspire women today in STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. They will be in conversation with Somak Raychaudhury. Quick introductions. Dr. Suchetana Chatterjee's research, Dr. Suchetana Chatterjee's research area is in the interface of astrophysics and cosmology. As an academician, she's very excited about physics teaching, physics education research, and public outreach of science in India. Dr. Sukanya Sinha's field of research lies in the interface of general relativity and quantum field theory. At present, she teaches physics at Indian Statistical Institute, Bengaluru. Dr. Suprakash C Roy is a physicist who retired as professor and chairman of the Department of Physics at Bose Institute, Kolkata. He has edited, authored, and co-authored several books. His most recent book is on the life of an extraordinary woman scientist, Purima Sinha, which forms the keynote of our session today. Dr. Somak Raychaudhury is currently the director of the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics, Pune. This is a SoftBank special session. May I please request our speakers to come up on stage? Dr. Sukanya Sinha, Dr. Suchetana Chatterjee, Dr. Suprakash C Roy, and Dr. Somak Raychaudhury. Dr. Roy? Ashton?
Good afternoon, evening, everybody. So our topic today is, as was already said, a very, very important one. The title gives it away, the focus of today's conversation. We start today with two figures from Indian science who happen to be women, chosen as hidden figures. I mean, this is a coined term that applies to the whole world, not just to India. Women constitute 50% of the world's population, and yet when you look at science and technology, research and teaching, careers in science and technology, women are not as well represented as they should be. And when we look back in time, we have a few iconic figures to look at. And we've picked two of them from the history of Indian science. And we ask the question here, are they our role models? How are we doing now compared to how they did, how they achieved what they did at their contemporary, with the contemporary science at their time? So today we have, we've assembled this small group who represent various aspects of this topic. As you heard, Professor Suprakash Rai retired as the head of Department of Physics at Bose Institute, where Bibha Choudhury did most of her work. Also, he is one of the authors of the two biographies of the two authors, the two characters we have chosen, which the Bibha Choudhury book has been out for several years, and the Purima Sinha biography is about to emerge. We have Sukanya Sinha, all the way from Bangalore, ISI Bangalore, who is a theoretical physicist. She is the winner of the Rabindra Puruskar, writing in Bengali, in science in Bengali, as well as practicing general relativity as a career. She also happens to be the elder daughter of Purima Sinha. And so we have a unique perspective from her. And then we have Suchetana Chatterjee, who is on the faculty of physics at President's University. And we all have between us experience of several years interacting with various systems of science and technology all over the world, having studied and taught at various universities all over the world. This session is, as you know, sponsored by SoftBank. Thank you, Purima. Right, so, thank you, Purima Raychaudhury. So, right, so what we want to do is start off by talking about why we actually chose these two characters. There are many other, it's by no means they are the two iconic figures in Indian science, but we chose both from physics, partly because of the biographies that have recently come out, but also because, well, there are quite a few characters that we could have talked about. There's Anandibai Joshi and many other characters from the field of medicine. We have Kamala Sahni in physics, who worked with Raman. We have Ashima Chattopadhyay, of course, who is an iconic figure in chemistry. And more recently, we have some really important figures who have emerged in science, talking about Chandrima Shaha, who has just become the first woman president of the National Science Academy, and the first female FRS from India, Gagandeep Kang, Charushrita Chakraborty, who tragically passed away recently. There are many, many names to look at. Now, we start all the way from these two characters that we have chosen. Bibha Choudhury, we have chosen from pre-independence India, working at the Bose Institute, but working actually in the hills of Darjeeling and Sandakphu, working on cosmic rays, one of the earliest cosmic ray physicists. And this is in the late 30s, early 40s. And then we have Purima Sinha, who worked, and she worked with D.M. Bose, who was then the director of Bose Institute. And then Purima Sinha, who after independence in the 50s, worked with Satyendranath Bose and is probably the first woman PhD in physics in India. So I'd like to start with Suprakash Babu to just, let's talk about what makes these two characters special. Can you talk a little bit about Bibha Choudhury to begin with? And then we'll go on to talk about Purnima Sinha. And then we'll move on to talk about their relevance in the subject of women in STEM today.
Okay. Somak, if I start this like that, who else other than Meghnad Saha and Satyendranath Bose done physics research in pre-independent India and came close to winning Nobel Prize? Then you will see that two characters will appear. One is Bibha Choudhury and his teacher D.M. Bose. And Bibha Choudhury and D.M. Bose, they discovered the new cosmic ray particle known as muons, or at that time called the only mesons, and just missed the Nobel Prize by a whisker, I will say, due to their poor equipment. The finer equipment was not available to them. So that was the greatest achievement of Bibha Choudhury.
But we must also, sorry to interrupt you, but one of the things that we must point out here is that you say she missed the Nobel Prize, but it was not because she did anything short of the Nobel Prize winning work. She published 4 papers in Nature, which outlined everything that could have been done to describe the discovery of the particle. But it might be a perception of women in science at that time that caused other people to ignore the work. Later on, when an Englishman comes and makes the same discovery, they are more recognized as the recipient of the prize.
Okay. That might not be the only reason, because the D.M. Bose was tagged with Bibha Choudhury, so it is not the single lady is going to win the Nobel Prize. If they at all get the Nobel Prize, then both will. So I don't think that is true. But anyway, what is important here is that in spite of their stellar activity in Bose Institute and later in University of Manchester, the people did not know her. That was one of the reasons that we thought that we will write that achievement of Bibha Choudhury and took limelight. And as you know, that after the publication of this book, she received the recognition after 30 years of her death You know that.
I have to tell you one
you can tell
interesting
that
thing that
one.
has happened recently. The International Astronomical Union decided to name all these extrasolar planets, planets that have been found around other stars other than the sun, 100 of them, and they assigned to each country one star and one planet to name. And this happened in December, about a month ago. And we, within India, held a nationwide competition amongst young people, school children, to come up with names for the star and the planet, and actually write an essay supporting it. And thousands of entries came. And finally, as a result, this star that was assigned to India was named Bibha, after Bibha Choudhury.
That's right.
And this came because school students, a large number of them, who had read about the articles that have been written about Bibha Choudhury recently, thought that that would be a wonderful name. So I think this is a great recognition for Bibha Choudhury that has come recently.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So
I'll continue.
that's right. Yeah, please do.
Okay, so Bibha Choudhury, I told that thing, but in order to understand and appreciate the great achievement, one has to understand the social and educational environment prevailing at that time. Because Bibha Choudhury was born in 1913, more than 100 years ago. And so she grew up in an environment in which the women's education was practically nil in India. And there are, in modern English education started with the establishment of Hindu college, we know, in 1817. And within 40 years, many colleges and 3 universities were built up. But whenever they talk about the women's education, to fix up the curriculum, what will be they will teach, then every time, then the question arose that, and there is a fierce debate that the women's education should be closer to life. So they will be confined to the sewing, then cookery, and housewifery, all those things, right? And at that time, I will mention that Brahmos, they made a huge changeover in, particularly in Bengal. The Brahmos become they are more liberal in and encouraged women to go to schools. And Bibha Choudhury was a Brahmo, and that is probably one of the reasons that she pursued the higher studies so far and so easily.
So when Bibha Choudhury went to Bethune College as an undergraduate, but then when she came to Kolkata University, she was probably the only female student in her class in physics?
In that class, yeah. She passed in 1936, in the 34-36 batch of MSc in physics, and she was the third woman who got the MSc in physics from Calcutta University.
And that's as late as the 1940s? Late 1930s.
Yeah.
And can I pass on to Sukanya to talk about Purima Sinha? Because Purima Sinha was born in 1927. She also came to study physics and ended up working with Shotin Bose. So what was her situation? I mean, she was not from a Brahmo background, right?
No, she was not from a Brahmo background. But again, can you hear it? It's here. Okay, audible now. No, Purnima Sinha was not from a Brahmo background, but her situation was also rather unique because her father, my grandfather, Naresh Chandra Sengupta, was a very, very liberal, progressive person who was quite offbeat. He was a writer and a lawyer and a jurisprudence scholar, and he really believed very strongly in educating women, the education of women. And Purnima Sinha, my mother, was the youngest of 8 children. And before that, so she had already in the background, her eldest sister, 24 years older than her, was the first master's in economics from Calcutta University. Tanima Sengupta, 14 years older than her, exactly Bibha Choudhury's contemporary, was the first MSc in chemistry, already studying science from Calcutta University. So she grew up, it was kind of a special background. So the fact that she went on to study physics and higher education was sort of a part of the familiar culture.
And she
So
went to a mixed college, Scottish
she
Church,
went
right?
to a mixed college, and she went to Scottish Church College. At the time, Presidency College did not accept women, and Scottish Church College, as a matter of fact, was accepting women even at my aunt's time. That was 14 years ago, when Bibha Choudhury's time too. Scottish Church College was co-educational. So she went to a mixed college, and again, just like, though she is like 14 years apart from Bibha Choudhury, she was the only female student in a class of 60 in her MSc class.
I must point out that this was the case in Cambridge and Oxford at that same time,
Really?
too.
So in
I mean, a
14
typical
years,
physics class would have one woman.
right. So that was, I think, across the world, it was pretty much the same. Yes. Um, so then she went on to do her, then Schuttenbusch accepted her as a PhD student. And interestingly, so what she worked on was, she was an experimental physicist, just like Bibha Choudhury, and she worked on X-ray crystallography, studying the structure of clays.
I will come back to it in a moment because I want to talk about
Right.
the skills, etc. Can I ask you, Dr. Rai, about Bibha Choudhury? When she came to work with DM Bose, so DM Bose did not accept her at the beginning. Can you tell me why, for example, that somebody of the stature of DM Bose would hesitate to take on a woman as a scholar? Was there a reason for it?
I think at that time there are several factors which affects that thing. One thing in the mind of their people, because as you know, the C.V. Raman and D.M. Bose are not born almost at the same time,
Right.
3 years apart.
Yeah.
And you know the story of the Kamala Shohani that.
So
the
C.V. Raman had 4
was-
women students,
yeah.
none of them completed a PhD,
Yeah.
and they had a very hard time
So
doing a
probably
PhD.
one of the reasons I think that at that time at the societal thing, that pre-mixing of the students, I mean the girls and boys, were not very comfortable to those older people. So sometimes I don't think that they do not consider the girls as a lesser intelligent than the men, but probably from the other reasons that they always think that at the workplace, when the boys and girls mix, there will be there will be disturbance in the educational level or some sort of research all the thing. So as you know that the DM Bose, unlike Raman, he very politely told that he didn't have any research project with him in which he can absorb Bibha Choudhury. So I don't
I think
that
this is to do with the perception that maybe because women working in laboratories long hours and
That is another
and also
reason, yeah.
maybe physically demanding work
Yeah.
was not good for women.
Yeah.
Even when we studied in Presidency College in the 80s, I know that they did not
Geology.
yet accept students in the geology department because it was felt that women couldn't go on field trips.
Ah.
But if you look at the work, I mean, I think Bibha Choudhury also points out that it was also felt that mathematics was probably not a good subject for women. I think there's a perception in women coming into physics and mathematics nowadays that often that might be difficult for women. But going back to what Purima Sinha achieved in the 1950s working with Schuttenbusch is that she showed that building instruments and doing experimental science can be done by a woman. So can you tell me the story of Purima Sinha?
Yeah, so that is very interesting because also unlike DM Bose, Schuttenbusch had absolutely no hesitation about taking a woman student. In fact, he was very proud of, he went out of his way to seek her out and give her a project where she had to build the equipment, an X-ray diffraction unit from scratch. And I think this also had a little bit to do with, this was post-independence, but just post-independence. So still the spirit was, like, do things from scratch, build on your own, don't have to import from outside. So I think that was also somewhat at play. And the way and this was heavy equipment. And the way she built it was also and he had trust in her to build it. And the way she built it was also very interesting because she put it all together by getting parts from a World War II scrap yard where they were selling these, instruments very cheap, at dirt cheap prices. So she bought like elements of that, put them together in the workshop at Calcutta University, worked with the applied physics unit, and also worked shoulder to shoulder with the workmen in the workshop, which was like really something quite different from the prevalent culture. And actually it took her so this scrap unit was behind Wellington Square. She used to go there with one of her seniors, pick up stuff, put everything together. And I think that was a tremendous achievement, to build her own instrument and then take readings and measurements from that.
I have to point out one thing here, and that is just to appreciate how groundbreaking this work was. The X-ray diffraction machine of the Braggs had just been invented. And if you look at what's happening worldwide, at the same time in Cambridge, the younger Bragg is assembling an X-ray diffraction machine, and Crick and Watson are using that. That's the end of the 50s. To discover the structure of the DNA, the double helix structure. This is happening at the same time as Purima Sinha building a machine like this from scratch in Kolkata. And what she is doing is she's looking at our native clay, right?
Native clay, and her research was actually, I think that's also pretty unconventional, that she had industrial funding for her research from the Assam Oil Company, because the structure of clay was important for knowing where to drill. So, so she studied, indigenous material, its structure, and published papers in Nature. And the stuff that they had to innovate was so primitive, in the sense that I was just reading some stuff that she'd written out, that this X-ray tube needed 30 kilovolt of voltage out there. So when it hit the target, it got really hot. So they needed a cooling unit. And even ice was not readily available. So they had to get it from the local pawn shop and build a cooling unit, put ice in it. So it was pretty remarkable.
What is wonderful here is that we have stories of women. And of course, we didn't go into the great detail of Bibha Choudhury's work also. But I think you should carry on to say how innovative and interesting it was. Because these are women who are working in a man's world and doing things that are expected of men, and doing amazing things in interfacing with industry, things that the buzzwords that we say now. Can you say a couple of things about Bibha Choudhury? And I'll go to Suchetana after that.
Talking about as you mentioned, that the difficulty they face, or the challenge they face about in research, right? You are talking about that thing. I have to mention that thing, yeah. Then Bibha Choudhury worked at Bose Institute on using the photographic plate to detect the cosmic ray particle. And you know that this type of thing, you have to expose it at different altitudes going there, and then the studying the tracks, the spine tracks they made in the photographic plate is very difficult. One has to work under a microscope in a dark room, and it's a very tedious work, one can understand. And so this is a very challenging in a way, that to work on the photographic plate, placing in the high altitude, going there, and at that time, I'm talking about in 1939, 40.
So you must have had to go on a horse to go to Darjeeling.
There is nothing, you have to go on the horse on the top of the hill, and then put it there, and then expose it for 5 months. Maybe she was not there for 5 months there, but she has to go and collect those plates and then analyze it in Calcutta. But so that was a very challenging thing. So no doubt about it. And I will talk about the Manchester.
Yeah, we'll come back in a moment. Yeah. So I wanted to engage Suchetana in this conversation, because you are a faculty now in Presidency College, Presidency University, and you are dealing with a young population about 100 years after Bibha Choudhury was born, and maybe 70, 80 years after they worked. Is it very hard for women to enter science and technology nowadays? Is it very hard to stay engaged?
Okay, thank you, Somak. So I wouldn't say that it is as hard as what Bibha Choudhury or Purnima Sinha had to face 70 years or 100 years back, as we always discuss that the importance of role models makes a large difference. I mean, Bibha Choudhury did not have a role model. She acted as a role model for a generation of women like me and many others who could actually see that, yes, women can do serious science. Now, if I talk in the context of today's women scientists or young women who are entering into the profession, then I would say that the scenario has definitely changed. For example, if we look at the enrollment in bachelor's classes, in undergraduate classes, in science, in physics, or in science in general, that is definitely, we don't have like one woman pursuing science or
Yes.
couple of handful of women. I think I read that Bibha Choudhury made a comment that the total number of women scientists I can count in England and India is like I can count in my fingers. That's not the case now.
But the enrollment is different across different subjects, right?
That's
So
right.
talk about
It's different across different disciplines, but at the undergraduate level, still we make numbers like 30% to even 50% and above for subjects like biological sciences. Physics is, of course, behind at the undergraduate level. But if we talk about the kind of achievements that Purnima, because when we are talking about Bibha Choudhury and Purnima Sinha, we are really talking about the topmost level of achievements. If we think about that, then the hardship that women face are not, of course, of not that magnitude, but because people have proven themselves that they are capable of doing serious science, but the gender stereotypes, as I think we heard in the 2020 Vision for Women session, plays a very negative role. And, you have strange ideas about what women can do and what women can't do, especially the stereotyping, I think has a problem. Of course, there is a social problem again, there is this stereotyping. And then each discipline, like, biology has their own social dynamics. Like, I would say dynamics of the discipline itself. Like physics is considered as to be least friendly to women. So those things also, because how the field has evolved over years. I mean, the dynamics is governed by who has been, developing or who has been writing the rules of the game matters. And there you have to fit in as a woman in a field.
Can I interrupt in saying one thing? Because it's very interesting to see the perception across disciplines. Right now, if you look at the student population in various sciences, more than 50% of biological sciences, you have women in a class. But maybe in physics and mathematics, it's 20, 30%, 35% is still higher than the global average in India. But we still have more women in our classes in university, higher than the global average. When you go to the highest level, however, when you look at faculty and prize winners,
Does not translate to that.
the Bhatnagar Award, which is the biggest award in India for scientists, I think the first prize to a physicist went only last year.
Yeah, a woman physicist got the prize only.
So that is difficult to achieve. And it's interesting to see, as you talked about gender stereotypes, what even now the scientific community thinks women can do very well. I mean, you look at the earliest women scientists, a lot of them, of course, Marie Curie is an exception, maybe Purnima Sinha, Bibha Choudhury exceptions, but the bulk of the work, some very important work was done by women. If you look at in astronomy, Annie Jump Cannon and her entire crew at Harvard did all the grunge work of looking at millions of spectra of stars and finding different kinds of stars. It's very, very tedious, very repetitive work.
Right.
If you look at the early software written for NASA missions, the moon missions, all the software, the programming was done by women. And some really innovative work, but it was really, really difficult grunge work. And so a lot of the tedious work has been done by women, and some of them have produced huge results. That perception has completely changed, right? Yes. So the gender stereotype you see now, I mean, can you comment on how women perceive themselves if you compare it with the situation that was there, say in Purnima Sinha or Bibha Choudhury's time?
Well, so I wasn't present at the 30s or 50s to tell that how they perceived, and they are great souls. So, but how in general, statistically, women perceived of their capabilities. But I can talk about my contemporaries or my students whom I have worked on. I think in general, and this is just not to do with science, but a societal issue that I see is that women who are as capable as men or their male peers just lack the confidence. They are capable, yet they think that, oh, I'm not good enough. So there must be something to do in
With the
probably it's also,
society.
yeah, the societal thing or how they are treated in class, in school, how they are, or for example, we always bring up this situation where we say that in books, if you have a picture of a scientist, it's always probably a male scientist wearing a lab coat. So now
Right.
there are a lot
With
of
two test tubes,
recommendations,
yes.
yes. Now a lot of recommendations that, make all professions in textbooks which kids are reading, make them gender neutral. That's one of the recommendations. And we always talk about that, oh, you have pictures of women scientists too. Because, when you grow up, I have heard kids saying that, oh, physics is hard. In India, I think the perception is little still different. But, the other problem that I would say is this work-life balance, that people think that, oh,
Yes.
being a physicist, you have to go a long way and, it takes a long time to get a permanent position. Maybe you are in your mid-30s and you are still, you are still in like postdoc positions or stuff. And so, raising kids or having a family, that's difficult. And that also, I have heard stories from my human colleagues in India who actually faced discrimination during actually recruitment. And they were told that, oh, will you be able to manage this job because, you have aged in-laws at home. So these kinds of prejudices are still there. And
So the
not
woman in
just
the
in
house
society,
is
but
supposed to, yeah.
in the scientific community too.
The woman in the house is supposed to look after both the kids as well
As
as
the
the relatives,
caregiver,
right?
that's
And
right.
that
That's right.
puts them behind.
That's another perception that
Can you,
families.
one thing is very interesting, the two characters we have chosen today, Bibha Choudhury never married, Purima Sinha, of course, married and had you. And so do you see, in your mother's life, do you see how having a family, of course her husband was a high-profile academic as well, impeded her work?
I suppose having a family, her husband was very supportive. That husband was supportive, in-laws were supportive. All that played a great role. And she managed well. Yet, I would say that having a family did impede to some extent, relative to Bibha Choudhury, was single, didn't have any ties. For example, her first job was in the Geological Survey of India when she just started. Then my father had a job in the US, so she resigned and followed him. So that was there, like I think if she had not been married, things would have gone differently. So there is some, definitely, and the feeling of responsibility about raising children still lies heavily more on the woman. Though in her case, because she had a very supportive environment, I think things went okay. But still, I think that makes a difference. That does make a difference.
So, but would you think, I'm looking forward to see what we are doing to make the situation for women any better in STEM in general in this country. Do you think, as somebody who's worked in science your life in the current generation, are things getting any better?
Things are getting better, I suppose, but not fast enough, maybe. But they are slowly. And regarding this work-life balance and working with children, there are more and more. In fact, an institute that I worked in with Somak is now the director. The previous director, when I was working, and I had a 4-month-old child, he was very supportive about creating offering all the funds and support for creating a creche in that institute. And that makes a big difference, and more institutes are coming forward to support in that manner, giving paternity leaves, you were mentioning, right?
Yeah.
So, society is changing, things are changing, but still we don't see that many women at top, so we have to figure out why that is happening.
So,
Do you want to? Yeah.
yeah, I was just trying to say that Suprakash, you probably, I mean, is it 1949 when Bibha Choudhury joined TIFR, I guess, right? She was the first. So she was the
So
first.
we should
Right.
go back. Let's do that, because one interesting aspect of this also is Bibha Choudhury is not only a pioneering scientist as a student in the 40s, she was the first woman faculty in independent India to join the top
TIFR,
research institute. So when she came, how was she perceived as the only woman faculty in an elite institution like the Tata Institute? And then she went on to the Physical Research Laboratory.
There are many stories. I don't think I will go in public because I have no evidence on that.
Right.
But I heard that Bibha Choudhury had a very difficult life at TIFR, and probably that is one of the reasons that she has to shift from TIFR to another laboratory in Ahmedabad. And there also, the one thing is that that is evidenced that people thought, I mean, her colleagues in PRL thought that she was a very tough lady, very tough lady. But one of her students, YC Saxena, who did his PhD under Bibha Choudhury, he said that it's a misplaced idea amongst the colleagues, that she was a nice lady, very helpful, supportive, and he was very glad to working with Bibha Choudhury. And
So is being tough, a tough lady, a bad thing or a good thing?
The one thing I just comment here, I had a talk in Asiatic Society on 14th of this month, and I met Bamba there itself. And when I mentioned that thing, she said that when you are in a hostile environment, you look to be very tough.
You have to be tough. So, right, absolutely right. And Purima can talk about this. Yes. But then, did you feel when you joined as a faculty in the 90s or 80s, was it still required for you to be tough in a mostly male background?
No, I think I didn't really feel that explicitly, but I do get as Suchetana, we were also discussing that somehow women and men with the same level of quote unquote aggressiveness. Men are not noticed as aggressive. You know, it's just that,
very true,
you know, they say that, oh my God, she's a tough lady, she's a dragon lady. But you know, if a man is like really aggressive and asking tough questions, nobody, so that's also societal
it's like you
perception.
are conformed to
So-
some idea of.
I would like to go out for some discussion, questions from the audience, if possible. But just before that, what we are discussing here are Bibha Choudhury and Purima Sinha as role models of women in science and technology in India today. I think they're global role models because people in the 1930s and 40s all over the world, you had very few women to look back and see that they shaped the kind of environments that we work in. And the question we're asking here, are these environments changing for young women to perceive themselves as part of this system in the near future? Right. And so are there any questions from the audience that you can ask? The mics can travel to you, yes. Oh, no.
Can you hear me now?
No.
No, yeah.
Actually, you asked the question I wanted to ask. That this is a scenario which plays across in sports, in politics, in corporate world, and in the world of academia. Things haven't really changed, but they're changing at a very, very slow speed. So, I mean, this question is probably to both of you. That what can we do more to change it, across?
So, do you want to? So, I guess I was just trying to give the example of TIFR. It's nothing to name one institution. Just I took the example of TIFR is because Bibha Choudhury joined there in 1949 as the first woman faculty. Now, if I look at the physics department, which is about 100 faculty members in TIFR.
Now,
This is now 2020. There are 3 women faculty. So
Still,
that's, I mean, how much did we improve? Now, my take and what we all discuss among colleagues across gender, I mean, we have a lot of men in the community who also shares similar views and are very proactive about
Yes.
the roles of women. I think we need more women in decision-making position and leadership roles. There's this glass ceiling that now we have undergraduate students, but there is a leaky pipeline and you just don't go to the top. So I think there must be some way that we should have more women in leadership roles. And I'm very proud to say that as you said, the Academy, president of the Indian Academy of
Yes.
Science, and then we had the first woman president in the
Indian
Astronomical
Astronomical
Society of
Absolutely.
India. So we
Yeah,
had the
this
first
year,
woman
this year.
president. And I think these are the pathroads I see which will probably
that
change
will-
the situation faster. So Sukanya,
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. The more, clearly there's a gap between, there are many undergraduates, fewer postgraduates, fewer PhDs, and then, the trickle down is like by the time you get to faculty, it's really, so again, like, I was just thinking that in my undergraduate, I didn't have a single woman professor. In my postgraduate, I didn't have a single woman professor. When I went to do my PhD in graduate school in University of Maryland, I didn't have a single woman professor. So it just doesn't get
So it is
out
tough
there.
for a woman
It's
going
like-
through the system.
Yeah.
Now, before I go to another question, I want to also comment on one interesting feature that you see in the women we've chosen here. Bibha Choudhury did her research in Bose Institute not as a PhD student, but as a research assistant. And because she probably felt, even though she wrote papers in the topmost journal in the world, not really fit enough to submit for a doctorate. I mean, if somebody has 3 papers in Nature nowadays, 1 paper would get them a doctorate. She then decided, because she was unhappy with her work, dissatisfied with the equipment she had, she wanted to go to Manchester, and she went and did a PhD in Manchester with a Nobel laureate. And then, so what, I mean, can you comment as her biographer, I mean, what motivated her to go do science in England? And because a journey for a woman in the 1940s to go alone to live in England to do a PhD must be a pretty unusual thing too.
Yeah. As you mentioned, that the availability of equipment at the time in the war period is very limited in India, almost unavailable. So she found that the working on the cosmic rays using photographic plate had no meaning in India using the low quality equipment. So that was probably the main reason that she chose to move to England. And none other than she moved to the laboratory of PMS Blackett, and who was then a Nobel laureate. When she joined, he was not Nobel laureate.
He got the Nobel Prize later on.
She joined in 1945, and she got Nobel Prize. He got Nobel Prize in 1950. But one has to understand that going abroad alone during war period by ship.
Yes.
There is no aeroplane there at that time from India.
And the war is going on, right? Second war, yes, amazing.
Going to Manchester is, I mean, it's unimaginable how the courage and determination, you have to understand the courage and determination she has to do science. And I will say that after finishing her PhD in Manchester, she came back to, as Somak said, she came back to TIFR as the first citizen, first female scientist. And then after her retirement, she came back to Kolkata and doing science till her death in 1991. So that is with collaboration with Shaha Institute,
But the
Calcutta
interesting
University.
thing is, I mean, the thing you have to see here is that it's his sole determination. The reason she went to England as during the war was just because of her scientific integrity. She thought that the work that she was doing could be better done there, not because she wanted a degree from the University of Manchester. But then the interesting thing here again is that to get to the top as a woman in that period, you had to be somebody like this, right? Like Bibha Choudhury or Marie Curie, somebody who really has the highest scientific standards. And probably at the same time, for a man, it wasn't really that requirement to rise to the top, to have the highest standards. I hope things have changed. Anybody has questions in the audience? Can the mic go to them, please? Yes.
Thank you very much.
You have to turn on the mic. It's the button at the bottom. What happened to the mic I gave you? What happened to the mic I gave you? It's there. Okay. Does anybody have a working mic?
Yeah, we can share the mic. We have 3 here.
Okay. Can I pass the mic on to them? We're losing mics from the
Hello?
stage. Another one.
Thank you very much. Though I arrived a bit late, but I don't mind sharing.
You keep your questions short
Yeah,
because we
yeah.
have only 5 more minutes.
Sharing my experiences so far with women scientists. I think 3 years back, all the 3 scientists who were selected for the S.S. Bhatnagar Award were women scientists. So that proves that the world is changing here in this country. All the
That's
3.
not true.
And I distinctly remember here the name of Dr. Ashima Chattopadhyay. She churned out scientists, great scientists. One of them is now the Vice Chancellor of MIT University, Dr. Dhrubajyoti Chattopadhyay. So not just one, I can name at least 50 of them who have been products of Dr. Ashima Chattopadhyay and many other women scientists. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. Does anybody have a point to raise which we might discuss? Very quiet. One more question? Okay. I've been told one more question. So somebody who has a really biting question. No.
Talking
He
about
was the
the
mic.
environment and the supporting infrastructure, have we got to learn from the Scandinavian society in terms of restoring the balance, where it is nearest to the best in terms of the supporting infrastructure for women?
Can you elaborate? I mean, what
in
feature of the Scandinavian?
In Scandinavia, they have got very extended leaves, paternity leaves. They
Right.
have creche, compulsory creche, all sorts of things, and they have the highest women jobs at the highest level in the world.
Yes.
They have compulsory boards where you have on the company boards you have like 130 presentation and stuff like that. Is that a model which we are looking at to replicate in this country?
So should I
want to comment?
comment? Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing this. I mean, we will not exactly emulate this model, but so Scandinavia is a great model, but then all countries in the world, they are trying to adopt all these best practices. For example, in India too, we are coming up with rules like if you have so many women faculty in a university or an institute, it's compulsory that you have to have a daycare there, or you have to give the option of work from home. So such things are coming, and also there are a lot of there are many government schemes. So we have the DST Women Scientist Scheme and many other schemes which I am not going through, which is very supportive of bringing women.
Particularly encouraging breaks in career.
Yes,
That is one of the things.
breaks in career so that they can come back to mainstream, or providing support so that, like for example, in conferences, daycare and creches have become almost
That is another
compulsory now
fantastic thing, that you
because
go to a
people
big
have
conference,
difficulty
yeah.
traveling. So now they have creches in conferences where they can keep the kids. So these are coming.
I've been told that our time has run out. So, I mean, can I just ask, to just round this off on a positive note, can you think of what we as a society, taking the cue from the Scandinavian argument that was given, are now doing that is actually positively helping women? And is there anything you've come across that you think would help women scientists to actually function better in the system that we have now?
I don't know. These steps are already. I think Suchetana already addressed that we all these things about taking breaks, and I think overall in the community, men are also becoming more sensitive. I must grant that. In many ways, it's so about so I think that is also a positive change, but. And the government is also proactively trying to put in these schemes. So I think things will slowly change.
So I think, one of the ways to round this conversation off would be that I think at the government level, maybe it's the Scandinavian countries will lead us, but even at the government level in any country, such things can't be done by policy.
Yes.
It can only be done when
Yes, yes,
society
yes, yes.
itself
Yeah.
rises up to it. And so it's a perception. So how supportive are the women scientists, how supportive spouses, how supportive partners, their families are
Right.
to the women scientists? Very, very important. And we have a lot of role models in there. Some of the characters that we are talking about who rose to the top have had very great support around them. That is one thing. And so as you said, the whole of society needs to be sensitive to the problems that women scientists face. Bibha Choudhury and Purima Sinha are characters, and Oshima Chatterjee are characters we can look forward to emulate. If we look at the environment they worked in, that environment in some aspects has changed quite a lot, because the larger society, the sensitivity to issues for women are changing, but the system, at a systemic level, hasn't changed much at all. And so we have to be sensitive to that. We have
Yes.
to be sensitive to how to make the workplace, and this, of course, is across all disciplines, but most definitely in science,
Yeah.
workplace has to be conducive to women.
Yeah,
Do
so
you have
we
the
should
last
be
word?
blind to gender. That's what I was saying. That let's not bring gender
right,
in any
exactly.
of the issues in society.
And we
I
should
mean,
stop using terms like women scientists.
we should stop
or mistresses.
scientists as
and-
scientists, and their gender is not relevant. I think we should stop at that note.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to us.
Thank you very much. Of course, the discussion, as all other discussions at Kalam, could go on for at least an hour more. But thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, Dr. Chatterjee, Dr. Roy, and of course, Dr. Raychaudhury.
Thank you.
From science to chocolat. Chocolate, lollipops, and strawberry. Joanne Harris discusses the many flavors of Vian Rocher in conversation with Sandeep Roy. Quick introduction. Joanne Harris is an author with 16 novels, 2 novellas, 2 collections of short stories, several screenplays, a musical, and 3 cookbooks to her credit. Chocolat was made into an Oscar-nominated film. Sandeep Ray is a novelist and journalist currently living in Kolkata. His first novel, Don't Let Him Know, won the honor title and was listed for several awards. He's a columnist for Mint Lounge and The Hindu, and the host of the Sandeep Roy Show on Audio Express and a weekly radio dispatch for San Francisco Public Radio. May we please have on stage Joanne Harris and Sandeep Ray.
Hi, everybody, and good evening. And Joanne Harris, welcome to Kolkata.
Thank you. I've already been given such a wonderful welcome, but it's so nice to see so many people here coming out for books and stories. So thank you. It's such an honor to be here.
And I should mention that what she's having is actually chai and not hot chocolate.
Chai is better than hot chocolate. If only I'd known all this before.
Oh, you might have had a tea shop. Vian Rocher, the tea shop.
That would have had its own problems, but yes, it's always a possibility.
The Vian Rocher masala chai shop. Before we actually get into chocolat and Vian Rocher, I just need to clarify something that I found while doing reading up stuff on you. So you are are you really the honorary president of something called the Role Play Club, where people dress up as gnomes and go into the woods and hit each other with rubber swords?
Yes. Now, if we backtrack several years, if we backtrack over 20 years for this, I was a teacher for 15 years, 12 of which were in a grammar school in the north of England, a school for boys, a private school that had existed since 1556. Some of the original members of staff were still there, and so it was obviously a community of old men and teenage boys, and I was one of 3 women members of staff. I arrived aged 25, and the others were in their 80s, I think, or at least they looked it, and they had had a tough time there because it was a very male environment, and it was a very churchy environment. It was a Church of England school, so there was a lot of chapel and cold showers and rugby, and I opened a club. It was called the Role Playing Club, and it was for playing Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games, and I designed a little poster, and the poster said, "Fight back, join the role-playing club." And most clubs had maybe a dozen members. The role-playing club had 250 members in its first week, so you can tell how many of the boys wanted to fight back. And they have been fighting back ever since, and for 20 years without me, but I'm still their honorary president, and many of them still talk to me on social media, actually.
So, and with rubber swords and things?
Well, the tabletop part of it became a sort of outdoor adventure part, where some boys did, indeed, we would go out into the woods and throw dry ice into the river to create atmosphere, and the boys would dress up as warriors and kings and trolls and orcs, and they would basically play Lord of the Rings, and I would design an adventure for them to go on. Some of them would be monsters, some of them would be adventurers. It horrified the head of religious studies at the school who disliked me, which was a bonus, but they loved it, and it gave the ones who didn't fit and the ones who felt that they weren't really part of that school community, it gave them somewhere to play.
Well, in a way, that actually, in a strange way, leads us to Chocolat, which is about the outsider who comes in.
I was also the one who didn't fit for many reasons.
But in Chocolat, we grew up in Kolkata. I don't know, I'm sure many of the people here will relate that even 20 years ago, before the markets had opened up and everything was available, sort of the height of cosmopolitanism was somebody came back from abroad and gave you a box of gold foil-wrapped Ferrero Rocher chocolates. Does your Vienne Rocher have something to do with that Ferrero Rocher we loved as children?
Not as such, no. Tangentially, yes. Rocher in French means a certain type of truffle, irregularly shaped so that it looks like a rock. Rocher also means rock in French, and so I thought that Vianne was because she is a rolling stone who gathers no moss, and she is also a chocolate maker. I called her Rocher, which kind of covered the bases for the pun, but it was a joke name. A lot of the names in that book are jokes of one sort or another, or puns, and so I thought it suited her.
And you made all these jokes because you thought nobody was going to read that book.
Oh, I'd been told that nobody would read a book set in a small community that nobody had heard of, in a place that nobody had heard of in Europe. And so, I'd had a good time writing it, and I thought that maybe that would be enough, that it wouldn't be necessary if it wasn't published. Then, that would be fine. I still had my job. I was teaching. I was happy.
So were you alarmed when it became such a huge hit and you thought, oh, people are going to go and delve into all these puns I made and these little jokes?
Well, not only the puns that I'd made, but also the ones of my colleagues who I had used as my source material for some of the characters, because I didn't have the leisure to go and observe small communities in France. So given that I was living in a small community, I was living in a school, which is the apotheosis of the small community, I wrote about that instead, and many of my colleagues, most of whom were old men, all they really needed was a change of costume and maybe a French baguette under one arm, and they made the transition between those communities really very well.
When you wrote the introduction after 20 years of Chocolat, you wrote in that, for the first time, I felt ready to write like a mother. What did you mean?
Well, my first 2 books had been written when I wasn't a parent, and I had still been unsure of what my natural voice was. Some people acquire their authorial voices very early, very young. I was not one of those people. I was very good at copying other people's voices, at pastiching, at parody, but I didn't really know what I sounded like. And I think partly it's because I didn't really know what I wanted to say. And so I wrote in the style of other people. But with Chocolat, I think what brought me to my voice was the fact that I just had a child. My daughter was 3 or 4 when I was writing the book. And so I wrote from the perspective of being a mother for the first time. It had never occurred to me to write about being a mother before because I didn't know what it felt like. This time I did know what it felt like, and so I wrote in a parent's voice. And that turned out to be the closest thing to my voice I'd ever done before. And this is possibly why I felt that Vian and I were, although we're really not the same person, I felt that we had more in common with a lot of other characters that I've written about.
You say, you knew what it felt like to be a mother, and in the book Lollipop Shoes, the mother says, to be a mother is to live in fear. Fear of death, fear, sickness, loss, strangers, the black man, the missed bedtime story, the forgotten kiss.
Yes, they don't tell you this when you become a parent. You do not sign up for this. You think that you're going to have this little wrapped bundle and you're going to have lots of fun with them. You don't realize that suddenly you have inherited a kind of primal parental fear which you will have for the rest of your life. They don't warn you, do they? If they did, we would take much more care about when we had children. But, I didn't realize this, and I didn't realize why my mother has always been such a very anxious parent until I had my own daughter and I started to turn into her, which is another area of horror which I've written about in my books too.
And in fact, how has your daughter watched the progress of Anouk in the book, where the mother is talking about Anouk's going away and is going to leave an Anouk-sized hole in my heart. And
do you know, I don't know if she's read it. I'm not sure she has read it. A lot of my family members don't read my books. My husband doesn't really read my books. I'm not sure whether my daughter reads the books that are set in France that are about Anouk or not. She may have done, but if she has, she's kept very quiet about it. I know she reads my fantasy books because she likes fantasy, but I do think that there's something a little uncomfortable reading something by somebody you know intimately, because it's quite hard to distinguish what's true and what isn't. I don't think that everything that I write is autobiographical, and not everything that Vian thinks is entirely what I think. It is filtered through a layer of experience, and I'm not sure that anybody really recognizes what's been filtered and what hasn't, except me. Which is good, because when I'm writing something which I know will be controversial, I can say, well, no, obviously that's just the character speaking, and I can distance myself from those things. But no, my daughter has always been very calm and understanding. As she often tells me, she is the adult in this relationship. And so she's been very good at just keeping out of the way when people ask her questions and when the press wants to talk to her about how she feels about being Anouk.
They don't ask her about her imaginary rabbit?
Oh, they have done. She just doesn't answer. I did borrow her imaginary rabbit and wrote it into Chocolat. I don't think she's ever quite forgiven me, though, because Hollywood changed it into a kangaroo, which is absurd, because the whole of the folkloric connotations about Easter and rabbits were absolutely right in the book, whereas I've never heard of the Easter kangaroo, nor would it make sense if there was one.
Well, they have a pocket, so they can carry eggs in it instead of a basket.
I guess they could. Apparently, on the set of the movie, the kangaroo was very badly behaved and kept punching people, which I think was karma.
Speaking of autobiographical characters, one of the things you have mentioned is that one of my favorite characters in Chocolat, the older lady, Armand, is based on a bit on your own great-grandmother inspired that character. And I was especially moved by that because I had the pleasure of knowing my great-grandmother till I was in my teens. And this
Oh,
bit,
lucky you.
Yeah, so this bit when the great-grandmother there says, first smoking, then alcohol, now chocolate. God knows, people asking her to give up things. And she says, now God knows if I gave up breathing, perhaps I might live forever. And my great-grandmother used to spend all her time, being told, oh, don't have deep-fried foods, don't have ripe mangoes. And she would try and eat them all the time.
Well, quite. And my great-grandmother was very like this. I didn't get your experience in that she died when I was 4, but I remember her very well. She was a huge influence also on my mother because she more or less raised her. And so she is still quite a strong presence in the family. She was a fascinating woman. I wish I'd known her better. She was a terrifying parent, a terrifying grandparent, and a very, very loving and indulgent great-grandparent. And so I was the one who got all the affection and all the presents and all the spoiling that her daughter and her granddaughter didn't get. And she died of diabetes one Christmas, having decided that she was just tired of people telling her what she could and couldn't eat, and she was going to enjoy a wonderful party with all her friends and her family around her. And after that, she didn't care what happened. And indeed, she enjoyed 2 weeks of wonderful celebration, and on the day we were meant to go home, she died very quietly in her room, half an hour after having played a game of cops and robbers with me. And I just felt, and I have felt since then, that, she was completely in control and aware of what she was doing. And I wrote her very, very much into that story, and everything that I remember about her, including the fact that she always wore red petticoats because she was in mourning for 2 husbands, and every time she thought she could stop wearing black, somebody else dropped dead and she had to wear black again. So because she was perverse and because she was a rebel, she wore these red petticoats and would occasionally flash them at people, sometimes the local priest, as he would cycle by on his bicycle. All these details are real. They're all the things that I remember about La Mimi, the matriarch of our family, who was my great-grandmother.
That's so wonderful because there's that saying that somebody doesn't die as long as someone still remembers them.
Absolutely.
And it is so beautiful that in your way, by putting so much of her into that character, she will live on and on through strangers who will be reading about her.
Absolutely, and people like her. People write to me saying, she reminds me of my grandmother, my mother, somebody that I loved. And I love that. I love the fact that one person's love for somebody can transfer to many other people so that they can see somebody they love in that person. And this is one of the great things about telling stories that are centered around people rather than just thinking that the people are adjacent to the story and there to serve it.
So these books, you've said, it started with Chocolat, then there's Lollipop Shoes, Peaches for Monsieur Curé, and then now The Strawberry Thief, where we follow Vienne Rocher along. You've said that you prefer to think of them as a continuation of the story rather than sequels. What is the difference in your head?
Well, in my head, a sequel carries on directly from the end of the previous chapter, whereas these are not. These are episodic. These are standout moments in a life rather than sequels which, to me, carry on in a kind of intuitive way from each other. I mean, I didn't know that I was going to write anything else about Vienne Rocher after Chocolat. In fact, I was determined not to, because like my great-grandmother, I am perverse and a rebel, and I was being told that it would be a really good idea if I wrote another Chocolat as soon as possible. And my publisher was telling me this because publishers like to make money, but I wanted to take risks. I wanted to have adventures, and the idea of staying in that village forever just seemed the most terrible thing, because I knew that I wouldn't be able to find anything new in that village or those characters unless I gave them space to grow and time. And so I didn't even think about doing it until several years after I'd finished Chocolat, when I felt when I felt, partly because of the enormous trust that my readers had in me, and had followed me to all kinds of places that were not the Chocolat Village and had seemed to enjoy those stories as well. So I felt in a way liberated from the responsibility of having to rewrite Chocolat, and instead I wrote The Lollipop Shoes, which was set at a different time, in a different place, and where I could say different things, and where that central relationship, which has always been that of a mother and her child, could develop to something else. And it was something unexpected. I didn't know, I didn't plan, I never have planned these things. They follow the slightly irregular path that life deals all of us.
So then, was it a very conscious decision for in Peaches, for Monsieur Curie, to bring her back to the scene of the crime, as it were?
Well, I'd always wondered whether or not she wasn't meant to go back to that village. I still don't quite know whether she is meant to stay there. But I did know that there would be something at some point that would call her back, partly because this story also belongs to Francis Reynaud, the priest, who has a journey of his own, and who hasn't left the village, and who may never leave the village, but who from time to time needs a lesson in something. And I knew that she had to come back, and that their story together wasn't finished. And also I had been playing with the idea of writing a story about the change in that community, which at the time was, it was echoing a sort of change in the whole of France, and France's attitude to particularly the niqab. And I could tell that they were going to ban it. And it had already happened in Holland, it had already happened in Belgium. I knew that it was going to happen in France, and so I wanted to write a story about the niqab, about why women might choose to wear it, about one particular woman who wears it, her story, and how her story would affect Vianne, because she is, like many of the other people that Vianne meets, somebody Vianne can relate to, but she has to learn to get to know her, and how that would change the whole of the village. And I wanted to write that story during Ramadan, at the time at which the niqab was not quite yet banned in France, and so I wrote it over one summer. And I was following current events as I wrote the book, and indeed, later that year they did ban the niqab, and everything that I thought might happen did.
And so you were writing a book about chocolate, with the chocolatier, and peaches in the middle of Ramadan when they could eat neither.
My one great regret about that book is that I wanted to call it Peaches for Ramadan, and my publishers would not let me use that title. And I was very sad, because I still think it was a better title, and it was a better reproduction of what would be in that book. But for some reason, they just would not have it. But yes, I wanted to show those two communities and their two leaders in opposition, and in fact to prove that they had so much more in common than was previously expected. And I also loved, I think I started off that story with the idea of the rivalry between the mosque and the Catholic Church, each one on its own side of the river, and the priest ringing the bell furiously to try to drown out the sound of the mosque, and the people at the mosque doing the same thing.
And is the chocolate in the middle the temptation for both sides, or is it the thing that can join both sides together?
Well, in a way, it doesn't do either, because it's Ramadan, and nobody is eating chocolate, and particularly the woman who Vianne is trying to get to know is inaccessible through the means that Vianne has always used. Vianne doesn't know her favorites because she won't eat chocolate. Vianne wants to help her. She doesn't want to be helped. And so she is an enormous challenge for Vianne, and her isolation, in a way, is very similar to Vianne's inability to fit into a community, and so they have a story to tell between them, which was a difficult story for me to tell, because it's not the story of my culture, and I had to go into our own Asian community where I live and talk to women wearing the niqab, and gosh, it's difficult to just start a conversation with a woman in a niqab and say, why do you wear this? It was quite difficult, and I didn't want to be rude. And so eventually I got befriended by the headmistress of the local Muslim girls' school, and all of the girls and all of the teachers wore niqab there. And so I was able to come in and be welcomed wonderfully by these women, and many told me their stories. And from their stories, I managed to find the story of the woman that I was trying to discover in my own way, because I didn't know what her story was until I was halfway through the book.
Mm. What do you think about the role that food plays in bridging cultures, though?
Well, everybody understands food. I think one of the things about writing about food, one of the things that it's taught me, because I didn't really know, I hadn't really thought about these things when I wrote Chocolat. I wrote it very fast. I wrote it in a sort of, in the excitement of doing something new, without thinking that there would be an audience, particularly not an international audience. But I realized that wherever it went, people understood the story, and they didn't understand it because they knew France necessarily, or because they, not even because they cared all that much about chocolate, because honestly, not every culture is as keen on chocolate as the French. But they understood it, I think, because everybody understands the idea of food, the gift of food and what it can mean to people, the idea of taking food with friends, with family. Everybody understood what it's like to sometimes be without food, and the complicated relationship that we have with food, and the idea that it can be a feast, or it can be a way of saying goodbye to somebody, or it can be a way of saying I love you to people when you're afraid to speak those things. And everybody has experienced food in all sorts of different ways, and it makes it easier to relate to.
You know, in Kolkata, where we are right now, it's not very customary for parents to say I love you to their kids, or kids to say, the way our mothers say I love you is they say have you eaten?
Exactly.
What have you eaten today?
Exactly, and I think my mother is very similar. And many people are very similar in this way. I think the gift of food is a gift of love very often, and of acceptance, and of welcome. And honestly, if that's what it means here, then I feel enormously welcomed, because I've just never stopped eating. But it's great. It's a way of connecting people. And obviously, I'm a linguist, and I think that it's important, if possible, to learn the languages of other cultures. But honestly, not everybody can, or they don't always have time. But actually, to accept food is another way of engaging with a culture, a way that doesn't take as long as trying to learn a whole language.
But isn't there a limit to that? As in, I accept the hummus, but I still am very Islamophobic, and I don't want the Arabs. Or Donald Trump has said, like, he loves to eat tacos. It doesn't mean change his views about Mexican immigrants.
Well, I'm afraid that another thing that's international is also stupidity, and he's a very good example of this. But no, it's. Of course, it doesn't go all the way. It doesn't. It's impossible. You can't cross a culture and say, I understand you because I ate hummus once, or I enjoy a curry. But it helps. It helps to break barriers. I think across so many cultures, there is a rule whereby if you have accepted food from somebody, if you have offered food to somebody, then you're on a different footing. And I think that in itself is an interesting and important thing. There is a particular kind of betrayal, isn't there, to poison somebody that you've welcomed into your house in one way, in a metaphorical way as well as a literal way.
Literally, the word for traitor is one who has eaten your salt.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think it's one of those things that we can use to explore and to learn.
Speaking of food, though, I wondered, when you said that when you wrote the first Chocolat, you had no idea that this story was going to continue in any way.
No, I didn't.
But now, after book 4, do you sometimes wonder if it would have been wiser to have expanded her repertoire beyond chocolates? Because does it get harder and harder to describe new chocolates in new ways?
Well, I don't want to disappoint anybody here, but I've kind of stopped describing chocolate on the scale at which I did about Chocolat. The Strawberry Thief is not about chocolate, although there is chocolate in there, because chocolate is part of Vianne, and making chocolate is part of what she does. But
now that we have tattoos instead.
It's not, well, exactly. It is not the central image of the book in the way that it was with Chocolat. Instead, I'm expanding into other areas, other metaphors, and other people's stories too, because this is not just Vianne's story. It never was. Even Chocolat was narrated by Vianne, but also by Reynaud. But what I've tried to do is to take this story further with another generation. So much of it is about Anouk and Rosette, Vianne's daughters, and where they'll go. And honestly, I can say I have no idea where they'll go, because I don't even know where my daughter will go in 5 years, 6 years' time, when I may or may not be ready to write another book.
And in fact, in Strawberry Thief, what is interesting is now Vianne is sort of the old-timer in the village who is suspicious of the exotic newcomer who has set up shop. So the tables have turned.
Yes, they have. And this is, I mean, I do think that the story has come full circle here. Initially, Vianne was the outsider. She was the one trying to find a place. Now she is accepted. Even Reynaud, who was such a pain in the neck in Chocolat, has become a friend and has accepted her. But somebody else is there, and she feels threatened by this new person. And whether or not this is justified or not, I'm going to leave to you to find out. But yes, Vianne has never been a perfect individual. She's never been particularly good at dealing with her own problems. She's very good at solving other people's, but is not so good at solving her own. And I've always felt that Vianne had lessons to learn, possibly about her slightly immoderate possessiveness when it comes to her children, but also
and
about
that's
the
not
way
you.
she
That's
fits.
nothing about you, right?
It's not quite me, but it's not a million miles away from me either. And I'm well aware of this. I'm very good at telling people stories, but being in my own story and knowing what to do is not always one of my great strong points. But no, I think that Vianne has things to learn, and I think that in a way this book, which is also set during Lent at Easter, but which has a role reversal for Vianne and Reynaud, and this new arrival, Morgane, who moves into the shop opposite.
And who might or might not be
and
also
who
a
may
witch.
Who may or may
Who
not
be.
have similar interests. And yes, I think having dealt with that, I think I'm not going to tell you that I've finished Vianne's story, because stories don't finish that way. Lives don't finish conveniently at the end of a story. And I'm pretty sure that she's not done with me. But I don't know, maybe the next book will follow her daughters in a more important way, because I do think that she's reached a heavy punctuation point in her story, if not a full stop.
Why do you think witchcraft is traditionally feminine, though?
Well, this is an interesting question. I think it's, certainly in Europe, it's traditionally feminine because the church in Europe has always been traditionally patriarchal, and accusing women of witchcraft was yet another way of keeping women suppressed and subservient. I think there is another answer, which is that witchcraft, whatever you want to call that, and I'm not talking about any kind of religious witchcraft here, but a sort of hedgecraft, a kind of an empathy, a knowledge about healing, is generally a domestic skill. And because domestic skills are viewed to be feminine, then it has been viewed as feminine. And the idea that women may not have a lot of social power, but they do have a level of intuitive and affectionate and domestic power which they can wield under the parapet of a patriarchal society. This is quite an attractive idea to me, and and I think that is partly what's given this idea that, you know, that witchcraft is female magic. Whereas men don't really need magic, do they? Because they've got the patriarchy, they've got everything else.
But given that, in a sense, do you think that translates also into how women are perceived as writers? You know, this whole idea of what is women's fiction. You had posted on Twitter several sort of life hacks kind of things for writers, things that, and one of them you said was guilt. Artists, especially women, you said, are often made to feel guilty about their work, as if they don't deserve their success or are neglecting relationships to pursue their ambitions. And of course, we all know about the late Sir V.S. Naipaul's famous comment about knowing whether a man or a woman had written something.
Yes, I'm afraid that Mr. Naipaul felt that if you read a paragraph and it was good, then it was obviously by a man, because no woman could possibly write that well. And yeah, I mean, I think we still have some of these preconceptions, certainly in the English literary world and the French literary world, both of which I know fairly well. But I suspect also in the literary world in general, we have a feeling that women's writing is less relevant to the human experience, that men, when they write for posterity, they write for the whole world. Women, when they write for other women. And I think, this extends beyond the world of literature. I think what we can see with the recent BAFTAs and the Oscar winners, I think that the message is very clear. Stories of men and men's violence are seen as important stories to everybody, whereas stories of women in their families, in their relationships, falling in love, finding themselves, those are just basically for women. They're a niche. I think I'm right in saying that women are not a minority here. And yet we are treated this way. And certainly in the literary world that I inhabit, the world of literary fiction, if a man writes a love story, it is seen to be important. If a woman writes a love story, it gets a pink jacket on the book and gets called chick lit. And that is really not fair.
I mean, and what about this whole idea? What do you think about the term of magical realism?
What do I think about it? To be honest, I don't really quite know what it is. I mean, to me, magical realism is something that specifically describes something that came out of South American literature, which I was not familiar with when I wrote Chocolat. I knew that there was a book called Like Water for Chocolate because people kept talking about it to me, but I hadn't read it, and I didn't read it until some years after Chocolat. And it was assumed that I had read it and that I'd taken inspiration from it, but that wasn't the inspiration that I'd taken. In fact, what I'd taken was inspiration from French folklore, particularly French tradition. So it's still a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, to me, magic realism begs the question, do people believe in magic or don't they? And if they do believe in magic, then it's not magic realism, it's just realism, right? And if they don't believe in magic, then it's not realism, it's just fantasy. So I'm not quite sure what that term means. And I have a number of theories about magic and what it means to me. Because there is a spectrum, isn't there, on which magic sits, depending on your perception of the world. And when I wrote Chocolat, I wanted to write a book on a number of different levels so that people could either see it as an outright fantasy, which is about a witch who makes chocolate, nothing wrong with that, or people could see it as a kind of metaphor where the magic means something else. And I wanted to keep it relatively fluid so that those people who have a problem taking seriously a story about witches and magic and chocolate would have something else to look for. And that the people who didn't have a problem would just read it as the story that it was.
And in fact, as you read all the books, as you quite rightly say, the chocolate starts receding. You know, she's still making chocolates, but sometimes you say, oh, she's living on a houseboat, so she doesn't have very much room to make as much elaborate chocolates. But the thing that is actually constant all through is the wind, and this idea of the wind that keeps coming and the wind changing. And even years before I read this, as a child, I remember being so entranced by the idea of a Mary Poppins who blows in with the wind and only promises to stay until the wind changes. And what is it that is so appealing about this idea of somebody who comes in with the wind?
Well, I think one of the things that I've had time to think about Chocolat a lot and to talk about it a lot. At the time when I wrote it, I had no idea what I was doing. I just wrote the story. And when people asked me what it meant, I would tell them, well, I don't know. What do you think it means? It's there for you. It's not for me to work out, pretend I'm dead. Now I have thought about the person that I was when I wrote it, and that's not quite the person I am now. And so I'm able to see certain themes coming out. In fact, while I was writing The Strawberry Thief, I was asked to record the audiobook of Chocolat, which was a really interesting experience for me because I hadn't read the book since I wrote it. There's no reason for me to read my own books unless I'm looking for a reference. And so I was able to read a book aloud and record it in a voice that had been mine 20 years ago. And that made it much easier to access that voice again. Obviously, it's changed a little because I've changed, because Vian has changed. But to get back into that mindset. And I thought as I was reading it, you know, that the heart of this book was never chocolate. People were fooled because they like chocolate and they wanted an excuse to think of chocolate and eat delicious things. But actually, the heart of this book has always been change and how we respond to change. And the wind is the factor, the central metaphor of change. And there is a song to which I refer in Chocolat and which I explain in much more detail in The Strawberry Thief, which is about the wind and change, and it has a story attached to it. It's actually an old Canadian folk song, which
So
my
it's a
mother
real
used
song.
to. Oh, it's a real song, absolutely.
Do you know how to sing it?
Yeah. It goes, v'là le bon vent, v'là le joli vent, v'là le bon vent, mamie m'appelle, v'là le bon vent, v'là le joli vent, v'là le bon vent, mamie m'attend. And it has about 20 verses.
Can we have a round of applause for that?
Hey, that's the easiest applause I've ever had for singing. It has many verses, and it's a rather strange, mystical, violent, frightening story. And it came sort of organically into this book. But it's also a song to the wind. And very clearly in this song, the wind is being placated because the wind is frightening and it's dangerous. And so the chorus basically goes, the good wind is on its way. But you know from the verses, which are deeply sinister, that the wind is anything but good. It's frightening. And change can be frightening. And as Vian grows and as her attachment to her daughter grows, her fear grows as well. And so much of this book is about Vian confronting change and the fear of change, and whether she is right to be afraid of it remains to be seen.
Because at one time the wind was what blew her into town and what might blow her away, but now the wind can actually blow her daughters away.
Absolutely, the wind can take anything it likes. I have a theory at some point that Vian is going to have to accept the wind as part of her personality, and maybe instead of resisting it, maybe go with it to see what happens. But who knows? I have no knowledge of the next bit of this story. But yes, the wind and change, and how change can always bring us back too. We can change back.
I want to open this up to questions, but while you're thinking about your question, I just wanted to ask you, I think it's in Strawberry Thief, you have this line where she's talking about Paris smells of baking bread and croissants, and Berlin of Eisbein, which I understand from a German friend is actually pork knuckle in jelly.
Oh yes, there's a terrible story about Eisbein.
And sauerkraut and Kartoffelsalat. What does Kolkata smell of?
Yeah, well, do you know what? It's a really interesting smell. Before I answer that question, I have to say that I have a brain condition called synesthesia, which means that I can physically smell colours. There are a lot of colours here. So a lot of the things that I can smell are actually not things that everybody can smell. They're things that I can smell. I mean, for instance, the whole of this canopy, which doesn't smell too much now because it's nighttime and I only really smell very bright colours. But when it was lit up yesterday in the sunlight, it had this amazing kind of hyacinth vanilla smell, which I had to keep shutting my eyes to remind myself that wasn't real. So it smells of hyacinth and vanilla to me. It also smells of chocolate because the colour red, which is everywhere here, smells of chocolate to me. If I shut my eyes, and I'm going to have to because I can't even think about the other smells. Okay, I can still smell the jasmine because there is a smell of somebody is wearing jasmine. I also have a kind of dog's sense of smell, so I can pick out things. It smells of smoke. It smells of frying food.
Yes.
Quite
frying
sweet
food. Calcutta
things.
smells
Quite
always of
sweet
frying
smoke.
food.
But also a particular kind of smoke. I'm not quite sure what it is. It's not wood. It's not leaves. It could be something else. All of those things, and it's quite unique. It's every city has its own smell. If you go to New York, which also smells of smoke, it's a different kind of smoke, and the frying food is a different kind of frying food. Also, it sounds here. Not all cities have a recognizable sound, but here it's sounds of car horns and of people and of just the enjoyment of whatever is going on here. It's a wonderful city.
You know, when I first went to America as a student, I couldn't, in a small Midwestern town, I could not sleep at night because it was so damn quiet.
Yes.
I was like, can I just turn on car horns and on TV? But, so are there colors that you can't stand because of the way they smell? Like my sister hates coconut. So I imagine a color that smells of coconut would be very difficult for her.
Oh, that would be hard. To me, coconut smells of, or rather coconut triggers or is triggered by a certain kind of light blue, and I really like coconut, so that's fine. There is a particular combination which I haven't seen when I'm here at all. I don't think people wear it, but there's a combination of purple and sort of mustard yellow, which I hate, which smells of rotting fish, and it's really nasty. It's also, by the way, it was the colour of the political party UKIP that launched Brexit, which if I hadn't hated it before, I would have hated it then. And it's also, very unfortunately, the livery of a train service in England. So every time I travel by that train service, everything smells of fish for hours. It's the most awful thing. But otherwise, most of my colours smell good.
Has your synesthesia helped you ever as a writer?
I think it must do. I don't really have a basis for comparison because I don't know what it's like not to have it. But I do know that when people talk to me about my style of writing, they say, well, you use a lot of smells, don't you? And you use a lot of colours. And yeah, I think that's inevitable, given that that's the primary way that I process the world.
In Strawberry Thief, Rosette says everybody has an animal, right? A shadow of their true selves. Hers is a monkey. Anouk, of course, is the rabbit. And you know where this is going. What would your shadow animal be?
I think mine is a sea otter.
Sea otter.
I think it is, yes. I think it's a sea otter. I love sea otters.
They hold hands and they fold hands and they float.
They hold hands when they float, when they're asleep. And also they put...
Attachment issues,
Joanne. Absolutely. And they put seaweed on their eyes to shield their eyes when they're sleeping. And because I'm very light sensitive, I have to wear eye masks when I sleep. Otherwise, I don't sleep at all. And also, I love the water. I was pretty much born in the water. Pretty much anything that has to do with water is something that I love. And so I think probably I'm a sea otter.
I'm going to open this up. So people having questions. Yep, this lady over there.
Is this working? Or?
Yeah.
It is.
First of all, I'm a great admirer, and I think I've read almost all your books, so thank you for giving them to us. Moving away from Vian, and your themes are all to do with fruit and food. So I would like to remind you of one of your books, 4 Quarters of an Orange, which is also mother and children. So was there a real-life inspiration for that family or that family story?
There was in a way. 5 Quarters of the Orange was the book that I wrote immediately after Chocolat. And I horrified my publisher with it because it was such a dark story. They said, well, we can't publish this just after Chocolat. People will riot. And so I wrote another book in between called Blackberry Wine, which was a much softer story. And I let them publish that first. But 5 Quarters of the Orange was also about my French family. It was the flip side of Chocolat in a lot of ways. Chocolat is a book which is very positive about food. It is about food as an expression of tolerance and love. 5 Quarters was very much food as an exploration of violence in the family, pressure in the community. It was set during the war. And much of it was about my French grandfather who had experienced the occupation, who had been a soldier, who had been given medals and the Légion d'honneur as a soldier, and then who had to basically run a school during the occupation in a village where the Germans had basically taken over half the place. And it was about the divisions within that community. And the family is not a pleasant family. It's not a loving family either. It's about tensions within the micro community as well as the macro community. And yeah, a lot of the little incidents in there are stories of my grandfather. For instance, there was one story he used to tell me. My grandfather was a born storyteller. All grandparents were. Perhaps all grandparents are storytellers naturally, but he would tell me many stories of the war, but he would never tell me about combat and fighting and people dying because he didn't feel that was suitable for a child. And when I would ask him what was the bravest thing you ever did, he would tell me this story. Now, my grandfather was a musician, and he played a number of different instruments, but he came from a very poor family, and so basically he would play whatever was around. And during the war, he was a bass player. He had a double bass, and he played in a band. And when the Nazis came, and I say Nazis rather than the ordinary German soldiers, because the ordinary German soldiers were there to occupy, but they weren't savage and barbaric the way the Nazis, the officers were. And when the officers arrived, they decided they wanted to form a band. And so they went round from door to door, finding out who had an instrument, and they would then requisition the instrument and take it away. And they found out somehow that my grandfather had a double bass. And so they came one night to requisition it. My mother, who was 5 years old at the time, heard somebody knocking on the door, opened the door, and saw 3 Gestapo officers standing there. And she just shut the door on them and went away. My grandfather, hearing this, said, "Who was there? Who was that at the door?" And my mother said, "Oh, it was just some Germans." So he went running out, found the Gestapo officers, looking cross, and said, "Well, can I help you, mein Herr?" And the officer said, "Well, we hear you have an instrument here. We're here to take it." And my grandfather then said, and he never could remember why, but he just rebelled. There's another perverse rebel in the family. And he said, "No, I'm afraid, mein Herr, an instrument is like a woman. You would not let any man just handle her strings." And then he just shut the door very quietly and waited. And the Germans, whose French was not excellent, took a little while to translate what he'd said between them. And my grandfather, who was waiting to see if they would leave or whether they would just basically, they could quite easily have just shot him. He heard about 5 minutes later, he heard the Germans beginning to laugh, which is, he says, about how long it takes a German to understand a joke. And that, he always said, was the most courageous thing he'd ever done during the war, and I put that story in the book.
The questions? I can't really see in the... Yeah, go ahead. Somebody's asking. 1 second, sir. Somebody has the mic, so...
I'll repeat it if you wish.
Yeah.
I'll repeat the question.
Was your grandfather fighting for the partisans?
No, he fought in the army. And then he was in counter-espionage. My grandmother, in fact, was running an illegal radio station from her quarters in the school, which was interesting because half of the school had been partitioned off to house German soldiers, and the other half was still pupils, and that was where she had chosen to run her illegal radio. And my mother, who, as I said, was 5, and who didn't really understand the concept of secrecy, would sometimes just run across the courtyard shouting, "Are you listening to your English radio again?" And the German officer in charge, who was a man who was basically doing his job, but sometimes could be very deaf on purpose, because he had a 5-year-old daughter at home, he would just look at his men if they were doing drills at that time, and none of them would say a word or repeat anything. And they were there for 3 years until they were finally discovered, which is another story, which is in the book.
I think we have time for probably one more question, so yeah, go ahead.
Ma'am, I wanted to know what's your favorite color and how does it smell?
My favorite color is chocolate red, which is the color I always called it when I was a child, and no one understood why. It's basically a very bright red, which to me, it was obvious that I should call it chocolate, and clearly for decades, everybody thought I was just really strange, but that was because it smelled of chocolate to me.
If you have a very quick, I know you'd been raising your hand for a while. If you have a very quick question.
It's a very nice question, given that all this, the wind plays a very important part in your stories, and the change of wind brings in good fortune, takes away good people. And I've been it's creates a lot of anxiety because I don't know from which side, which part of the world the wind is coming to bring good fortune. And actually geographically pinpoint the wind which brings good fortune and which takes away the good fortune. Is the north wind which takes away is cold.
If you only knew.
If only I knew that, I would follow it.
I think I'm looking for I think that is all the time we have for Joanne. Will be here, so you can get your books signed by her.
You.
And I should, welcome you again to Kolkata. I'm sure you've been told 100 times by now, but Kolkata is supposed to be the sweet capital of India, and we are in time for the Nolen Gur and Shande. So I hope you get to try some of that.
I'm sure I will.
Leave.
I'm sure I will. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
If I wasn't able to answer your question, I'm very happy to answer it while I'm signing books. I think I'm going to be in the bookshop, right? Is that right? But I'll be very happy to chat to you if you come over. Thank you.